Fort Cornwallis was the first line of defense for the new settlement of Georgetown in Penang, established by Captain Francis Light for the British East India Company. The company has been seeking a site to fortify its position in the Malay archipelago where it could protect and expand its highly lucrative spice, silk, and opium trade. In August 1786, Light landed on Point Panaga, the present day Esplanade, cleared the land, and started constructing Fort Cornwallis, named after then Governor-General of Bengal, Charles Marquess Cornwallis, to protect the new colony and instill a sense of safety amongst new settlers. Author and publisher Marcus Langdon has studied the historical evolution and use of spaces at the fort extensively. He has written several books and articles on the subject.
Welcome to Fort Cornwallis. Today we're going to take you on a journey through the 236-year history of Fort Cornwallis. Why Fort Cornwallis? This was the spot very close by where Francis Light first landed in 1786 to form an East India Company settlement. Many would call this colonialism. In fact, at the time, this was about trade. The East India Company was the biggest trading company in the world. The fear was, in fact, that the Dutch would block off their valuable trade route to China. So the British, or the East India Company, had to find a port along the way where their ships could dock, refuel, and carry on their voyage. The British government also wanted to have a place where they could base their navy on the eastern side of the Bay of Bengal, so the ships could protect the east coast of India during the northeast monsoon. But Francis Light's first concern was to protect his men. He and his few European fellow officers and so on, and about 100 sepoys landed in July 1786, and within a few days, after clearing the jungle on this part of the point, started to build a fort here using the nibong palms, which grew in profusion on the point. So they cut the trunks, which are very straight, and used them vertically to create a timber wall. It was actually the same size as the fort we see today, around 150 metres square. In front of the eastern gate was the inner harbour, which is the calm waters on the leeward side of the point. On the northern side of the fort, which we'll have a look at later, is the Strait of Malacca, and it was called the outer harbour, and many ships also anchored on that side. So let's now go inside the fort and see what else it has to offer. In 1803, the Napoleonic War broke out between Britain and France. The Lieutenant Governor at the time was Robert Townsend Farquhar. He was very progressive and ordered a major upgrade of Fort Cornwallis. 1.7 million bricks were involved in completing the fort. All of those bricks were either made here in Penang or brought up from Malacca. Go-downs were completed on the southern side, barracks and various other buildings were on the western and northern side. On this eastern side were some barracks. There were cook rooms for the Bengal sepoys and cook rooms for the Madras sepoys to cater for different cultural tastes. And there were some lockups for the military as well. Today, the fort is more or less a recreational space inside. Here we have some mobile cafes, which are temporary to cater for the visitors. After the Western Wall was knocked down around 1930, there was a lot of debate about what to use the fort for. It was generally housing displays, social events, cultural events, anything people could come up with, but it had no specific use. By the 1960s, they decided to put a really nice garden in the middle of the fort with a fountain and everything, and this was installed in 1966. Then in around 1970, this amphitheatre here was constructed, along with buildings to house officers and so on along the northern wall of the fort. Today the amphitheatre is little utilised, just the occasional function, so options are wide open for its future use. From the 1890s, following decommissioning of the fort some 10 years earlier, there was much agitation to demolish the whole fort to make way for new storerooms to cater to the new busy port and Swettenham Pier. The decision by council at the time kept getting put off. Money was put in the budget many times, other things happened and money was taken out again. So it was lucky that the fort actually survived through until the early 20th century. In 1930 though, the western wall was completely demolished to open the fort to the esplanade or padang to make way for public use of the fort as a play space. It was sheer providence that in 1934, Sir Shenton Thomas, the governor of the Straits Settlements, visited Penang and argued that the fort should be kept as a historic relic. He therefore ordered that the remaining 3 walls of the fort be preserved. However, by then all the internal buildings had been knocked down, except for the ones on the southern side where we're standing now. In the 1990s there was a drive to restore the fort to its former glory, and in 2000-2001, led by the USM Archaeological Department, the western wall was completely rebuilt using old bricks from buildings in town and around the place, and using very scientific methods to test mortar and all the other materials that were involved in the reconstruction. So today it's a reasonably faithful reconstruction of the original wall. After the First World War, there was a renewed push to demolish the fort, but with a moat surrounding the fort, something had to be done. At the time, it seemed like a good excuse to fill in the moat was to quote that malaria was rampant in the town and the moat needed to be filled in. But in fact, the real reason for filling in the moat was so that machinery could demolish the walls. Records from that time show that there was no significant malarial outbreak, therefore we can only conclude that it was an excuse. In 1922, the Harbour Board won a contract to fill in the moat, and it was filled in with beach sand. So today it's very easy to excavate, and over the past year or two, the moat has been excavated to a point where we can see where all the inner and outer walls are, so it should be a fairly straightforward job to excavate the moat right down. It will then be sealed and filled with water again and present a very attractive new addition to Fort Cornwallis and the town. On my right here are the row of storerooms that we believe were built early in the 1800s, perhaps around 1801, perhaps during the Robert Townsend Farquhar upgrade of the fort. These storerooms were used for all sorts of purposes: storage of gunpowder, ammunition, military items, guns, harnesses, clothes, probably food. At one stage, we even stored fire engines here. Not your typical fire engine, mind you. We also found that during the excavation of these storerooms, that the real level of the floor is nearly a metre below the level we see out here today, which means the fort has been filled over time, both inside and out, by up to a metre. In fact, this is fairly consistent throughout the town. During the Second World War, the Japanese occupied Penang. At that time, remember that the western wall had been demolished. They built a train track for a light train rail to come from Swettenham Pier, round all the goods sheds, through the fort, out onto the esplanade, between all the goods sheds that they constructed on the esplanade, and back to Swettenham Pier. Amazingly, when the excavation started here, these train tracks were discovered, and we've added a little trolley that's come down from the hill, but is reasonably typical of the sort of trolley that might have been used. These trolleys, as one can see, entered each of these warehouses, and we can only imagine what goods they stored. Could be armaments, could be food, could be anything like that, rice, weapons. The imagination runs wild. Towards the end of World War II, the Americans developed long-range bombers, super fortress bombers they were known as, and in January 1945 these planes made several raids over Penang and bombed numerous sites that were occupied by the Japanese, including the storehouses here. Right in the middle of this row, a bomb went right through the middle of the roof, landed in the floor, created huge shockwaves into the adjoining rooms, which we can still see today. The Japanese then hastily reconstructed this area in concrete, And this still shows on the wall here where the surface has been left in concrete where the Japanese extended it, and also can be seen inside the storage rooms where they simply left off where the bombed section of building had collapsed and just reconstructed the concrete over the top. All the doorways were then given square lintels at the top, and these still remain on those buildings to recognise this little portion of history. Following the extensive restoration of these storerooms, it's anticipated that we install a historical museum covering the period from the earliest part of the fort right up until today, including restoration methods and so on. Currently there's a team being appointed to look into the museology that might be installed in each one of the storerooms. For many years, this building behind me here was erroneously thought to be a chapel. This building was only built in 1814 as a gunpowder room. It's a classic British gunpowder room design. Today, the building is used as little more than a storeroom, but there are plans to restore it once funding is available. For those who are not familiar with Francis Light, this is a statue of the man credited with founding an East India Company settlement on Penang Island in 1786. As there's no known portrait of him, the statue was actually crafted after a portrait of his son. It was made in England and shipped out here, arriving in 1939, and it was installed on the southern side of the fort by the Governor Sir Shenton Thomas, the same man who preserved the fort. There are plans to reinstall the statue on the southern side in its original position, yet to be decided. This is one of very few surviving military buildings in Fort Cornwallis. Despite the date of 1814 on the small sign out the front here, it's not exactly known when this building was built, but certainly later than that, and probably before the mid-19th century. It was used as a magazine to house gunpowder, cannonballs, rifles, that sort of thing that would have been stored in other parts of the fort and brought up here when required. There was often piles of ammunition, like in cannonball form, stored around the fort in front of the cannons as well. So there's basically a supply point for the armaments that line the northern face of the port, looking out to the bay. The lighthouses we see in the background were built first in 1881. That lighthouse got pulled down, and the tall one you see today, big white one with all the masts and so on, that was put up in 1883. That replaced a tall mast made of timber, which was basically just a tall tree trunks, but it contained all the flags that they would use as semaphore, and that would contact another similar one on the top of Penang Hill. Penang Hill had a very good view out to the Andaman Sea to the north, so if any enemy ships were approaching Penang, they could quickly signal the fort. On the tall white mast that you can see here, there's a small bubble-like structure about halfway up. That was actually the lighthouse. The light was inside there flashing. So it was a dual-purpose item which could show the flags and work also as a lighthouse. Then in 1914, the other lighthouse, the shorter one behind it, was constructed and was used up until more recent times. The fort was actually designed to hold about 66 cannons on its walls, but that number was never mounted on the fort. They never fired a shot in anger. In fact, all the firing that they did was in salute, so they were blanks. Whenever visiting dignitaries arrived, there was a whole schedule of a number of cannon shots had to be fired to welcome these dignitaries, varying from 11 to 21 shots. If the governor from the Straits came, he'd have 19 shots fired. Also, the fort would often ring out with cannon fire during the midday whenever the mail arrived. There'd be a morning gun at 6 o'clock in the morning to wake everybody up. There'd be a 9 o'clock gun at night to send them all to bed. They also had funny things like a 3-gun salute whenever a fire was spotted in town. And that would also happen from Penang Hill. It was on occasion, they would see it from the hill before anybody would see it in town. So these cannons, the signals were very useful to inform the whole people of Penang what was happening. We're standing here on the north seafront, just in front of the northeast bastion of Fort Cornwallis. And this is probably around the area that Francis Light and his party first landed in 1786. At that time, of course, it was an open beach, and in fact it was an open beach until the late 1800s when the seawall was built. It was a nice, easy access for ships that would anchor out in the harbour and bring their crew and passengers and so on ashore in smaller boats. The esplanade here, of course, was part of the fort. It's a military term which means a space between the fort and any other buildings. But we should finish by saying that the fort, although heavily armed, was deemed quite an insignificant structure by the experts of the day. They even called it a toy fort quite often because of its size, being a small fort and quite easily attacked and destroyed from close quarters from the sea, from the northern seafront here. Perhaps what it most significantly represented to the early inhabitants was security under a foreign power. The fact that the British opened a settlement here opened up a flood of people who wanted to come and settle. Today the Fort Cornwallis precinct offers recreational opportunities for locals and visitors alike. The North Seafront has made it much more enjoyable to stroll along the seafront at night without the traffic being right upon them. And the fort itself can be developed in a way that will attract attention from international visitors. Much thought has to be put into how we utilise the fort in the best way. It's a treasure from the past that's irreplaceable.